Imagine hearing a howl that hasn't echoed across Earth for more than 10,000 years. Now imagine scientists announcing that they've finally brought one of history's most legendary predators back from extinction. That's exactly what happened when headlines around the world declared, "The dire wolf is back." Social media exploded. News outlets called it one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs of our time. Some people celebrated it as the beginning of a real-life Jurassic Park. Others called it a dangerous experiment. But here's the question almost nobody is asking. Did scientists actually resurrect the dire wolf? Or is the truth far more complicated? Because once you look beyond the headlines, the story becomes even more fascinating than the news itself. Today, we're uncovering exactly what happened, how scientists created these animals, and why many experts refuse to call them true dire wolves. A company trying to bring back the past. The company behind this incredible announcement is Colossal Biosciences. If you followed biotechnology over the past few years, you've probably heard their name before. They're the company working on ambitious projects to revive extinct animals like the woolly mammoth and the Tasmanian tiger. Their mission is nothing short of extraordinary, using modern genetic engineering to recreate animals that disappeared thousands of years ago. And now, they claim they've reached another major milestone. 3 animals that resemble dire wolves are alive today. But before we decide whether that's true, we first need to understand how they made them. Finding DNA from an Ice Age predator. Bringing back an extinct species isn't as simple as finding old bones. Scientists need usable DNA. For years, researchers discovered dire wolf fossils inside California's famous La Brea tar pits. Unfortunately, the tar preserved the bones, but badly damaged the DNA. Without good DNA, bringing the species back would be impossible. Then came a breakthrough. Researchers obtained 2 exceptionally valuable fossils from an international collection. One was a 13,000-year-old tooth. The other was an astonishing 72,000-year-old inner ear bone. These ancient remains still contained fragments of genetic material. Using advanced DNA sequencing technology, scientists carefully reconstructed large portions of the dire wolf genome. It wasn't perfect, but it gave them something incredibly valuable. A genetic blueprint they could compare with living animals, comparing the dire wolf to modern wolves. The next step was finding the dire wolf's closest living relative. That turned out to be the gray wolf. Scientists compared the ancient dire wolf DNA with the gray wolf genome, searching for every important genetic difference they could identify. Some of those differences controlled body size. Others influenced skull shape. Some affected muscle development. And several appeared responsible for the thick pale-colored coat often associated with dire wolves. Once they identified these differences, the real genetic engineering began, using CRISPR to rewrite nature. Instead of cloning a dire wolf cell directly, which is impossible because no living cells exist, scientists used one of the most powerful genetic tools ever invented: CRISPR gene editing. Think of CRISPR as extremely precise molecular scissors. Rather than creating DNA from scratch, it allows scientists to edit existing DNA by replacing specific genetic instructions. Starting with gray wolf cells, researchers edited around 20 different genes. These edits were designed to give the animals several dire wolf-like characteristics. The changes included a larger body, a broader, more powerful skull, stronger jaws, thick, light-colored fur, other physical traits associated with ancient dire wolves. After making these genetic edits, the scientists had something completely new: gray wolf DNA, carefully modified using information recovered from an extinct predator. But they still needed those edited genes to become living animals. From a laboratory to living wolves. Once the edited DNA was ready, scientists inserted it into egg cells taken from domestic dogs. These embryos were then implanted into carefully selected surrogate mother dogs. For weeks, researchers could only wait. After roughly 62 days of pregnancy, history was made. Healthy pups were born. The first 2 were named Romulus and Remus, inspired by the legendary founders of Rome who, according to myth, were raised by a wolf. Months later, a 3rd pup arrived. Her name was Khaleesi, a nod to the famous wolves featured throughout Game of Thrones. For the first time in thousands of years, animals carrying carefully engineered dire wolf traits were alive. The announcement spread across the world almost instantly. To millions of people, the impossible had become reality. But behind the excitement, scientists began asking a very different question. Were these actually dire wolves, or simply genetically modified gray wolves wearing the appearance of an extinct legend? And that's where the real controversy begins, the biggest question. At first glance, the answer seems obvious. They look like dire wolves. They're larger than ordinary wolves, have broad heads, thick pale fur, and carry genes taken from an extinct species. So doesn't that make them dire wolves? Not according to many scientists. In fact, this is where the story becomes far more controversial than the headlines ever mentioned. Here's the problem. Most people assume a dire wolf was simply a bigger version of today's gray wolf. Movies, video games, and TV shows have reinforced that idea for years. But scientifically, that's not true. Despite their name, dire wolves weren't actually true wolves. They belonged to a completely different evolutionary branch that disappeared around 12,000 to 13,000 years ago, near the end of the last ice age. For decades, scientists believed dire wolves were closely related to gray wolves because their skeletons looked incredibly similar. But then everything changed. A discovery that rewrote history. In 2021, researchers successfully analyzed ancient dire wolf DNA. The results shocked the scientific community. The study revealed that dire wolves split away from the ancestors of modern wolves nearly 5.7 million years ago. That's an enormous amount of evolutionary time. To put that into perspective, humans and chimpanzees separated around 6 to 7 million years ago. So dire wolves and gray wolves are about as distant from each other as humans are from chimpanzees. They may look alike, but genetically, they're a very different story. Could they even have had puppies together? Here's another surprising fact. Modern canids, like gray wolves, coyotes, and domestic dogs, can often interbreed. That's why wolf-dog hybrids and coyote-wolf hybrids exist today. But according to researchers, dire wolves were likely too genetically different to successfully breed with any living canid. In other words, if a real dire wolf had somehow survived until today, it probably couldn't produce healthy offspring with a gray wolf. That tells us just how unique these ancient predators really were. Some scientists even believe this genetic isolation may have contributed to their extinction. Unlike modern wolves, they couldn't gain new genetic diversity by hybridizing with closely related species as environments changed. So, what did Colossal actually create? This is where opinions begin to divide. Instead of rebuilding an entire dire wolf genome, Colossal started with gray wolf DNA. Then they edited roughly 20 genes using CRISPR. Those edits produced animals with several dire wolf-like features: larger bodies, more powerful skulls, light-colored coats, and other physical characteristics inspired by ancient DNA. It's an incredible achievement. But here's the important detail. Those 20 edits represent only a tiny fraction of an animal's entire genome. A gray wolf genome contains around 2.4 billion DNA base pairs. Changing just a handful of genes doesn't completely rewrite an animal's evolutionary history. And that's exactly why some researchers argue these animals should be described as genetically modified gray wolves, not resurrected dire wolves. There's another twist. Even those 20 edits don't all come directly from ancient dire wolf DNA. According to Colossal's chief science officer, Beth Shapiro, several of those genetic changes were already known mutations found in modern gray wolves. For example, some edits responsible for the animal's white coats weren't copied from dire wolves at all. Scientists simply used naturally occurring gray wolf mutations that produce lighter fur. That means only part of the genetic engineering was directly inspired by the ancient genome itself. So while these animals certainly resemble dire wolves, their DNA still remains overwhelmingly gray wolf. And that's the heart of the controversy. If an animal looks like a dire wolf, acts like a dire wolf, but most of its DNA still comes from a gray wolf, what should we actually call it? That question has divided scientists around the world. And in the next part, we'll explore the fascinating debate over what truly defines a species, and why the answer may not be as simple as anyone expected. So, what actually defines a species? At the center of this entire debate is one surprisingly simple question. What makes an animal the animal it is? Is it its DNA? Its appearance? Its evolutionary history? Or a combination of all three? Believe it or not, scientists don't always agree. And that's exactly why Colossal's announcement sparked such an intense debate across the scientific community. Colossal's argument. When critics questioned whether these animals should really be called dire wolves, Colossal's chief science officer, Beth Shapiro, gave an interesting response. She explained that the answer depends on how you define a species. According to her, species classifications are human-made systems, and different scientists may use different methods. Colossal argues that because these animals physically resemble dire wolves, with their large size, broad skulls, muscular build, and thick pale fur, they can reasonably be described as dire wolves under a morphological species concept. In simple terms, if an animal looks like the extinct species and shares its defining physical traits, then it can be classified that way. Many evolutionary biologists believe appearance alone isn't enough. Today, the most widely accepted method for identifying species focuses on genetics and evolutionary history, not just physical features. This approach is known as the phylogenetic species concept. Instead of asking, does it look like a dire wolf? Scientists ask, did it evolve from the same evolutionary lineage? That's a very different question. And based on current genetic evidence, the answer appears to be no. These animals were created from gray wolf DNA that has been carefully edited, not from living dire wolf cells. So while they resemble dire wolves externally, their evolutionary identity remains overwhelmingly gray wolf. Looks can be deceiving. Nature has fooled scientists before. There's a fascinating process called convergent evolution. This happens when completely unrelated animals evolve similar appearances because they live in similar environments. Take wolves and hyenas, for example. At first glance, they seem surprisingly alike. Both have powerful jaws, long legs, sharp teeth, and hunt large prey. But genetically, they're only distant relatives. Hyenas are actually more closely related to cats than they are to wolves. Their similar appearance evolved independently. The same principle reminds scientists why appearance alone isn't always enough to determine what an animal truly is. A philosophical question. Even some scientists working with Colossal acknowledge that this debate has no easy answer. Geneticist Love Delane, one of the company's advisors, admitted that across the entire genome, these animals remain overwhelmingly gray wolf. He also suggested that deciding how many genes must change before an animal becomes a different species isn't purely a scientific question. It's also a philosophical one. Where do we draw the line? 10 genes? 1,000? A million? No one has a universally accepted answer. And that's why the discussion continues. The same debate is coming again. What's even more interesting? This probably isn't the last time we'll face this question. Colossal's most famous project is still underway, bringing back the woolly mammoth. But the process is remarkably similar. Scientists aren't cloning frozen mammoths. Instead, they're editing the DNA of modern Asian elephants. They're adding genes associated with thick fur, larger fat reserves, smaller ears, and better cold tolerance. The goal is to create an elephant that can survive Arctic environments while displaying mini mammoth-like characteristics. So if that project succeeds, will we call it a woolly mammoth? Or a genetically engineered elephant? The same debate that's happening today over the dire wolf will almost certainly happen again. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson from this story. The extinction isn't really about reversing time. It's about using modern genetics to recreate lost traits in living species. Whether that counts as bringing an extinct animal back to life is a question science and society may continue debating for years to come. But while everyone argues over names, another part of Colossal's work is receiving far less attention. And many scientists believe that's actually the company's most important achievement.